The United States believed it had China backed into a corner. A fresh wave of tariffs was expected to apply pressure on Beijing, forcing it to negotiate on Washington's terms. But China did not waver. Instead of backing down, it played a strategic long game, one that had been in motion for years. While China did retaliate with its own set of tariffs, that was merely the first move in a much broader and carefully orchestrated counteroffensive. Rather than reacting impulsively, China focused on reinforcing its control over critical global supply chains, securing the raw materials and resources that the U.S. and its allies heavily depend on. At the same time, it actively engaged in forming new trade partnerships with countries seeking alternatives to American economic influence. Every step China took was not just a defensive response but part of a larger plan to reshape the global economic landscape itself. As February 2025 arrived, tensions between the two economic superpowers had reached a boiling point. The U.S. imposed tariffs on over $60 billion worth of Chinese imports, targeting key industries such as computer components and electric vehicle parts, the essential building blocks of modern technology. This was a continuation of the broader strategy Washington had been pursuing since the Trump administration, aimed at bringing manufacturing jobs back to American soil. The message from the U.S. government was clear. China needed to abide by new trade regulations and economic policies set forth by Washington. However, what followed demonstrated that this battle was far more than just a trade dispute. It was a contest for global influence, control, and economic supremacy. The U.S. claimed its actions were designed to protect American jobs, but from Beijing's perspective, this was something much larger, an attempt to curb its growing power on the world stage. China did not panic, nor did it rush to respond. Instead, it made its move strategically, striking in ways that would have the most significant impact on the U.S. economy and political landscape. Within days, Beijing imposed tariffs on $35 billion worth of American goods. But this wasn't just about matching numbers, it was about carefully choosing which sectors to hit in order to maximize pressure. Chinese tariffs targeted key industries in politically crucial American regions. The agricultural sector took a direct hit, with heavy tariffs placed on soybeans, a major export from the Midwest, the heart of U.S. farming. Meanwhile, the energy sector in Texas, a powerhouse of American oil production, was also impacted. The goal was clear: to turn influential U.S. business sectors and political groups against Washington's own trade policies. While the U.S. was preoccupied with restricting Chinese exports, China was quietly fortifying its backup strategies. It expanded trade relations with Brazil, Russia, and even Mexico, ensuring that it could source essential goods and materials without relying on the American market. But its most significant move involved something far more valuable than agricultural products or oil: rare earth minerals. Rare earth elements are the foundation of modern technology. They are critical for manufacturing everything from smartphones and electric vehicles to military defense systems. China, as the dominant supplier, controls over 80% of the world's rare earth production. So, rather than engaging in rhetorical threats, Beijing subtly indicated that it was prepared to restrict exports of these critical minerals. Without these materials, the U.S. would struggle to sustain its technological and military advancements. It was an unspoken but unmistakable warning. No matter how aggressive Washington's trade measures became, China remained indispensable to the future of global innovation. Yet, China's counteroffensive didn't stop at agriculture and rare earths. It extended deeper into the U.S. energy sector. China imposed new tariffs on American oil and liquefied natural gas, LNG, putting immense pressure on one of the U.S.'s most lucrative industries. For years, China had been a major buyer of American energy exports, but when tensions escalated, that dynamic shifted almost overnight. Energy contracts were abruptly canceled, shipments were disrupted, and U.S. energy companies saw profits plummet. But China didn't just walk away from the energy market, it swiftly moved to establish alternative suppliers. It secured long-term energy agreements with Russia, strengthened partnerships in the Middle East, and ramped up its own domestic energy production. Even if trade relations between the US and China improved in the future, these newly established deals would remain in place, permanently reshaping global energy markets. This was not just a short-term economic loss for the US, it was the erosion of a strategic foothold in one of the most vital sectors of the global economy. At the heart of this confrontation, however, was the battle over technology. The US took aggressive measures to block China's access to advanced semiconductors, cutting it off from crucial American suppliers and banning companies like Huawei from collaborating with US firms. The goal was to slow down China's technological progress. But rather than being crippled, China responded by investing billions into developing its own semiconductor industry, advancing artificial intelligence, and expanding its domestic 5G networks. Rather than relying on American technological superiority, China focused on self-sufficiency. As a result, its tech sector didn't just recover, it started competing at the highest level. In some areas, it even began to surpass the US, marking a significant shift in global technological leadership. Amid all these economic and industrial maneuvers, China quietly deployed another powerful economic weapon, its holdings of US debt. For years, China had been one of the largest holders of American government bonds, with investments exceeding $800 billion. While selling off all its holdings at once would have been detrimental to China as well, it took a more calculated approach, gradually reducing its purchases of US debt. The consequences were far-reaching. With China pulling back, borrowing money became more expensive for the US government, which in turn led to rising costs for everyday Americans, higher mortgage rates, more expensive car loans, and increased credit card interest rates. It was a slow but effective financial squeeze that no trade war could resolve overnight. While Washington remained fixated on imposing tariffs, Beijing was actively strengthening its global alliances. It signed new trade agreements with European nations, Southeast Asian economies, and even American allies like Latin America and Russia. The objective was clear: to diversify its economic partnerships and ensure that China would never be at the mercy of US trade policies again. This shift had profound consequences for American businesses. Losing access to the Chinese market was one thing, but now they also faced growing competition from Chinese companies in regions where they once had dominance. China's expanding economic influence made it increasingly difficult for American firms to maintain their traditional footholds in global markets. Meanwhile, America's closest trade partners, Canada and Mexico, found themselves caught in the crossfire of the trade war. Both countries faced new US tariffs, and rather than simply retaliating, they adjusted their strategies. Canada imposed tariffs on American agricultural products, while Mexico targeted US steel, pork, and whiskey. However, beyond these immediate responses, both nations began deepening their trade relationships with China, a development that posed long-term challenges for US economic influence. A major transformation was underway, not just in trade but in global supply chains. For decades, China had been the world's manufacturing hub, but rising trade tensions led businesses to look for alternative production sites. Yet, instead of losing its grip on manufacturing, China had anticipated this shift and proactively invested in new production centers across Vietnam, Indonesia, and Africa. The strategy ensured that China would remain at the center of global production, even if factories moved beyond its borders. For American farmers, the trade war was particularly devastating. China had once been a top buyer of US soybeans, corn, and pork, but those sales evaporated as China turned to suppliers in Brazil and Argentina. This left American farmers with unsold crops, falling prices, and rising debts. While the US government offered financial aid, it was a temporary solution to a long-term problem. Once China secured new suppliers, there was little reason to return to American farms. Beyond agriculture, the broader economy felt the pressure. Tariffs drove up costs for businesses that relied on imported materials, and those costs were passed down to consumers. Everyday goods became more expensive, from groceries to electronics. Meanwhile, stock markets grew volatile, with every trade announcement triggering dramatic fluctuations, affecting retirement savings, pensions, and investments for millions of Americans. This conflict had transcended mere tariffs. It had become a defining moment in economic history. The global balance of power was shifting, and whether the U.S. could adapt remained an open question. While Washington sought to reassert its dominance, China was busy reshaping its own economic destiny, expanding its technological, industrial, and diplomatic influence in a way that could permanently redefine the future of global trade.